I think we're live. Hi everybody, this is Aisha Shirzai.
And I'm Dean.
And we're very happy to be here with you guys again this Monday. Happy Monday. I hope all is well with everybody. So today we have a great topic to talk about and something that we come across on a regular basis at our work.
All the time.
All the time.
Yeah.
And it's about whether disease is caused by genes or your genetic makeup, or is it the environment that causes the disease? And I want to emphasize to our viewers to stick to the end of the video. In some of our previous videos, a lot of people had questions and we usually address them at the end as a conclusion. We would really hope for you guys to stick with us to the end of the video because this is going to be an exciting topic to talk about.
It's going to be amazing at the end. So that's the topic that we hear all the time. Is it genetic or environment? And although we're neurologists and neuroscientists, and we believe that neuroscience covers everything, we're a little biased. But it does apply, the genetic and environment question applies across the board to all diseases. And this is an exciting time.
It is very exciting. So we know that, most of the diseases, well, all diseases are caused by our genetic makeups. There is a gene behind every disease that expresses itself. But, how much of it is the gene and how much of it is an environment? That's usually the question that everybody asks.
And the important point of that is why it's exciting is because we are, in the next 10 to 15 years, we are at the precipice of what's called personalized medicine, meaning given your genetics, given your genotype, medicines and treatments and influences will be given to you, influencers will be given to you that will match you and your genetic makeup. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. And it's moving exponentially. This is extremely important because in this world of information, Google and all the other venues, internet venues, there are populations that get this information and others won't. That difference will be significant when it comes to your healthcare.
Absolutely.
How much you know about your genes in the future, or how much people will tell you that they know about your genes, yet we're not there, will influence whether your money and your healthcare will be used efficiently and effectively.
This is very relevant because nowadays there are a lot of companies that offer their services to give you your genotype or your genetic makeup and your proclivities for certain diseases and your strengths. So it's really important for all of us to know what's the importance of having all that information.
Yeah, so genetics are important, like we said. Every cell has a roadmap. It is in the genome, it's in the DNA. That DNA tells you what you will be like. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting that in the last few years, we've learned that all genes, if you have the same genes, even twin studies, their environment determines how that gene expresses. Things happen to that gene, or parts of that gene, or chromosome, where the expression can change, or the expression could be turned on or off. That's critical. That tells you that genetics are influenced by environment. And yes, there are genetic diseases where if you have the given genetic disease, you will have the outcome because one particular protein or enzyme is affected. For example, in Huntington's, it's in chromosome 4, a particular locus or area in gene is affected. If a father has it, the son will get it at a certain age. We know it, and we know what kind of disease process will take place.
Exactly.
Other diseases such as Tay-Sachs and PKU, which is phenylketonuria, and cystic fibrosis are other diseases, and many others, where one gene is affected, one protein is affected, and so, but even there, environment has influences. But for the greater number of diseases, that's different.
Exactly. It's not like that. There are very few diseases that are, purely genetic, but a lot of them have, the environment that influences them, and especially for the diseases that you and I deal with, tell us about Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah. So Alzheimer's, this is on a daily basis. I had a grandmother who had Alzheimer's. My mother had Alzheimer's. Will I get Alzheimer's? Well, in Alzheimer's, about 5% of the cases, 3 to 5%, the genetic influence is significant. to the point where we call it early onset Alzheimer's, familial Alzheimer's. You have the genes such as presenilin-1, presenilin-2, APP that are affected. The likelihood of getting the disease is very high early on. Even in those cases, it's not 100%. But for the greater 90 to 95% of Alzheimer's and dementias in general, it's a combination of genes. And those genes determine whether you'll be resilient in the face of certain conditions, or you will have pathology. For example, if your immune system is not as strong, if your oxidative response is not, or response to oxidative damage is not as strong, those are the genes that determine what will happen to you. The way I describe this is your genetics in Alzheimer's, and this applies to many diseases, determines a range. A range is wide as 20 to 30 to 40 years. Everything else that happened to you throughout life determines if you're going to fall earlier in the disease process or later in the disease process. I call it three-dimensional chess. You know, the first layer is the genetic makeup. Then is what happened to you in your 20s. You had head trauma, let's say, or a car accident, or significant depression, or things of that nature. Then what happens to you in 30s and 40s if you develop high blood pressure, kidney disease, and other things. That adds further assault to the system. Then what happens to you in the 50s and 60s when you get end organ damage, meaning the organs themselves are affected, the heart, the kidney, and then finally the brain. It's multi-layers of damage, and your body's ability to respond to it, to clear the cholesterol, to clear the inflammation, to have an appropriate immune response, to not have too much inflammatory response. Exactly. That determines if you're going to get it early on, depending on the range that your genes have given you, or later. That gives you incredible power to affect disease. Diseases like Alzheimer's, like stroke.
Exactly. So same goes for stroke. You know, there are certain strokes, very few of them, that are purely genetic, and people usually develop them very early in life, in their 20s and 30s. Those are purely genetic, and it makes them very susceptible to environmental risk factors. But for the most part, about 80% of all strokes, whether they're ischemic or hemorrhagic, are preventable, which means that the environmental factors have a major influence on them. And it's very important for all of us to understand that, because that kind of empowers us.
Exactly.
To say, okay,
exactly.
There is some genetic underlay, but there's a lot of the environmental factors that influence that. The genes, the genetics makes us susceptible to certain environmental factors.
Yeah. So this is why the question that comes up, should I get a genetic testing? So if you had grandparents or parents who had Alzheimer's, let's say, so should we get genetic testing? Well, it's a very controversial and difficult one. It's a personal one at many levels. Myself, we both had grandparents that had Alzheimer's. 2 grandparents on my side and 2 grandparents on your side. That's right. And I forget quite a bit. I guess we all do, but the funny joke is Dr. Sherzai is a preeminent neurologist and memory disorder specialist, but forgets and loses codes more than anybody else. I've lost 3 or 4 codes.
And I misplace my keys all the time.
Exactly. We all do. Now, let's say that if I do the genetic testing, which doesn't mean that you will definitely get the disease, it's a risk factor. And every time I forget, guess what I'm going to ascribe it to? It's the genes. It almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the way I look at it, and some people say, and patients have made a good argument, it's going to be a motivation factor for me. The way I look at it, I say, I already have the motivation factor. I know my risk. I mean, generally. I don't need any more stress. Stress is another factor that affects the brain. So I know the stress. I'm going to work towards pushing that range later in life. But if I found out right now, without any cures or direct medical cures, besides the ones that we're doing, which is lifestyle, it would just create a lot of stress in my life. But there are other diseases where knowing the genetic component, the genetic influence will matter, because we have already factors that will influence them. So it's important to have that conversation with your personal doctor.
Exactly. And as technology moves forward, there are a lot of things that one can do. You were talking about precision medicine. Finding about your genetic risk factors can actually focus some of the interventions, So it just depends on what condition you are concerned about.
Yeah, or if you're in a research setting.
Exactly.
That's
yes.
also critical because in a research setting, the genetic component matters. For example, we have clinical trials in Alzheimer's, knowing if somebody has ApoE4 or certain genes.
Which is the gene for the late onset Alzheimer's disease.
Correct. That actually will affect our treatment, our response to the treatment, so that's important. So this was, we just wanted to kind of introduce this topic, and maybe in the future we'll go into it in more detail, but we wanted to, at the end, summarize what our thoughts are about genetic testing and where you can take it from here.
Exactly. So the major point that we could give to our viewers would be, you know, genetics, all diseases are caused because of certain genetic makeups that we have, and it's the interaction between your genetic makeup and the environment that manifests into the disease.
Correct.
And there are certain diseases that have a very strong genetic component, but for the majority, a lot of diseases are because of this interaction, and the genes make you susceptible to the environmental exposures.
And you have control over the environment.
Exactly.
That's what's important.
Exactly. So
And,
not
yeah.
to compare yourself to, say, we all have some relatives, you
Yes.
know. We've all had that uncle who smoked till he was, you know, well into his 80s and 90s, and nothing really happened to him. Just because we've had that background or somebody in that family had that background doesn't mean we're going to have it as well. It's different for everybody.
Correct, absolutely. So the recommendation is have the conversation with your doctor, and in a research setting that's definitely needed. And in many settings, the genetic information for you, given that there are no cures for many of the diseases, will not necessarily help you. If you're going to use it as a motivation, realize that with that motivation comes anxiety. But there is the environmental influence for a lot of these diseases that you can implement even now, even without knowing the genetic risk factors. So our recommendation is to keep an eye into the horizon of research and into genetics. In the next 10 to 15 years, we will have a revolution in this field, and medicine, as you know it, will completely change.
Especially when it comes to precision medicine.
Correct. So again, thank you for the few minutes you gave us. I hope that this was helpful, and we will see you again next week.
Have a wonderful week, and we'll come back to you next Monday, hopefully with a new topic. And thank you so much for your comments and your feedback. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.